What I'm trying to do, I'm trying to make a sense out of the big, a big, and
I shouldn't be laughing.
The problem is, the more I dig in,
yeah,
the more dirt comes out.
Right.
And then I get overwhelmed.
Yes.
And because I'm not a journalist,
Yes.
I
Yes.
don't know how to sort out
Yes.
in my own head.
Why do you think journalists are any better at it?
My name is Samira. Some people call me Sam. I was born in Iran, but New York is my home. 25 years ago, back in Iran, I witnessed a revolution that had promised emancipation from Western domination. It also led to terrible bloodshed and death. My father's execution at the hands of the new regime forced me to confront then the first outburst of what would become known as Muslim extremist fundamentalism. My family and I emigrated to the United States, carrying our roots in our suitcases, searching for a home where we could find a purpose for our shattered lives and give meaning to the rubble and ashes we left behind.
You know, what's fascinating to me when you look at America is that still the promise is here, the possibility is here. And I think that the new immigrant communities in the United States are just beginning to find their appropriate political voice. And you'll see some amazing political change as a result of that.
It took many years, but finally it was in New York that I felt I could unpack my suitcase to put down my roots, to love without fear and live without rage. Then came September 11, 2001. Now, the anti-American flames of wrath had reached America itself. What I had escaped from more than 2 decades ago seemed to have caught up with me. The first time, I chose to escape. This time, I wanted to understand. What do you think is the difference between killing in the name of Islam with killing in the name of democracy?
I don't want to comment on that. That's just a contentious question. You're just trying to bait me.
No.
No,
I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, but your questions are very contentious.
What was the source of this mad rage? What motivated these nihilistic acts of extreme terror, destruction, and massacre? Who was this Osama bin Laden?
There's a tape of bin Laden after the Twin Towers went down where he's dining out on 9/11 and saying, and then a brother came to me and said, an aircraft has crashed into the World Trade Center. And I said, beware, hold my brother, wait one moment. As if he knows that the schedule will be that in 17 minutes the second aircraft will hit the second tower. That's sheer dining out on Time and Newsweek's coverage of what happened.
Like everyone else, I turned to the media for explanations for the terrorist attacks. But I soon found myself yet again a victim of attacks, only this time from the media itself and their constant visual assault exploiting the images of terror. Feeling utterly frustrated, I set out to explore the reasons behind these attacks for myself. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know where to look or go. I didn't know whom to ask, nor did I know what I would find or what I was letting myself in for. All I had was my backpack and a willingness to explore and to understand.
It was revealed today that the United States intentionally drew the Soviets into Afghanistan to lure them into their own Vietnam. Now we're going to do a story about that every night for the next 10 days so that you'll never forget that. That's a story you'll never hear. That's a story you'll never hear. What you get is the prevailing illusion that once the prevailing illusion is established, that the Soviet invasion was the greatest threat to peace since World War II, that's the story. And that will be the story that's written in the history books, and that will be the story that is still repeated. I still pick up the newspaper and read about things that happened in Afghanistan 20 years ago that was a piece of propaganda 20 years ago, that has already been admitted to as a piece of propaganda by someone who wrote a book about it and is laughing about the fact that it was a piece of propaganda and how everybody believed it 20 years ago. And someone's still writing an article based on that comment because they looked it up in a newspaper from 20 years ago and still printing it as fact today.
Any serious study of this period, the end game of the Cold War, would have to include an understanding of what the Cold War was to the United States of America.
This is the Kremlin, citadel of Russian communism. Looking at Russia, we might see it as a country to be studied, as we study other nations of the world. Yet we know that Russia today is regarded as a grave threat to our nation, to our freedom, to the peace of the world. Why so? Here, in Russia, you see the reason why so many nations are building up their defenses. Here, in Russia, you see the reason why we are spending billions of dollars in defense production. The leaders of Russia tell us their only concern is the defense of their own nation. Is this so? Or are they ambitious for world conquest?
The Afghan covert action program was very important in turning the tide of the Cold War. I think it was a major factor, if not the major factor.
According to Washington, human rights champions from the CIA have come to Pakistani territory guided solely by concern for the Afghan refugees. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the United States President's national security advisor, explained in no uncertain terms what lay behind that propaganda ploy. He showed the object of intervention, Afghanistan, to the ringleaders of the mercenaries.
There were 2 points of view in the Carter administration during that time period, which was really a problem for the United States. One viewpoint viewed the Soviet Union as an aggressive force bent on conquering the Persian Gulf. The other view, which was the State Department Cyrus Vance view, viewed the Soviets as mainly interested in protecting their southern border. So there was always this constant back and forth. Over Afghanistan, it all came home. Afghanistan became the place where all the projections and all the wish fulfillments all met from one side. And that was the point in time in which American politics changed forever.
Certainly a more confrontational wing, which was represented by Brzezinski, and a less confrontational one represented by Vance and some others. And Carter himself moved back and forth.
The ultimate responsibility is totally Jimmy Carter's. It's got to be the president who sifts out these different strains of advice.
Point man, if you will, was Brzezinski.
Zbigniew Brzezinski was the guy who really got the whole Afghan business in motion. Zbigniew Brzezinski was as hard an anti-communist fanatic as has ever been in the American government. He couldn't get over what the Russians did in Poland. There was no way he was ever going to give them an inch on anything, and he led Carter into the hardest possible line position on what to do about the Russians in Afghanistan.
Zbigniew Brzezinski has done an interview in which he has stated quite clearly that he was intentionally luring the Soviets to their destruction at least as early as July of 1979, 6 months before they entered.
He suggested with this interview that by helping the Mujahideen 6 months before the Soviet came into the Afghanistan, it was the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Empire.
Did you come to an agreement with the Chinese on how they could collaborate with the U.S. to bait the polar bear to the north?
Well, first of all, why don't you ask the questions more intelligently, because then that'll make it easier to respond. If you phrase it that way, about baiting and so forth, you're really not trying to elicit constructive answers.
I'm only using your own expressions.
I did not use the expression baiting. What we did was we discussed the areas in which American interests and Chinese interests were congruent. And that was discussed, and there were in fact some agreements regarding American-Chinese collaboration against the Soviet Union. Yes, the answer to that question, if it's formulated that way, is yes.
Did President Carter comprehend the full range of the implications of your political vision and strategic thinking, particularly with regard to China and Afghanistan?
I think he did. We had a lot of close contact. We saw each other several times a day. I knew him instinctively in the sense that I knew what he was thinking. I could even tell from his facial expressions. And I think he knew me equally well. We had a very close rapport. This doesn't mean that he listened to me in everything. He often disagreed, and he was the boss. I was merely working for him and with him. But I think he understood me very well.
In your 1998 interview with the French magazine Le Nouvel Observateur, you said that you knowingly increased the probability of a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
The point, very simple, was this. We knew the Soviets were already conducting operations in Afghanistan. We knew there was opposition in Afghanistan to the progressive effort which was being made by the Soviets to take over. And we felt, therefore, it made a lot of sense to support those who were resisting. And we decided to do that. This, of course, probably convinced the Soviets even more to do what they were planning to do, which was to try to make a general takeover of the country by force of arms, and got them embroiled in an adventure which proved disastrous for them.
In the same interview, you were asked whether you regretted having supported Islamic fundamentalists and having armed future terrorists. Your reply was, what is more important in the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War? Do you still stand by this statement?
It sounds like a very free translation of a comment regarding the importance of the Taliban. The Taliban itself wasn't very important. What was important was the fact that the Soviets pulverized Afghanistan, really destroyed it and polarized it, and subsequently produced the circumstances which are still confronting us in Afghanistan and that part of the world. But the fact that the Soviets became involved in an adventure which they could not win was positive from the standpoint of the West. Don't forget, the Soviets were busy training terrorists all over the place in the 80s. They had camps all over the Soviet Union for terrorist activity. Can you imagine what the world would be like today if there was still a Soviet Union? So yes, compared to the Soviet Union and to its collapse, the Taliban were unimportant.
So you're suggesting that it was the Soviets who instrumentalized Islam?
Yes, well, who else? Unless you think it's us or Israel.
Against the U.S. and Israel?
Against the West.
Against the West.
Against the West. Against what they considered to be the infidels. The concept of the jihad was born as a consequence of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
And who gave them the arms, the aid, and the financial support to fight against the Soviets?
A lot of countries did, because if the Soviets had won, it would have been even worse. Unless you believe that the Soviets should have been assisted or permitted to win, in which case one has to ask, what would the world situation be like if they had in fact prevailed?
But I'm just a little bit confused here, because earlier you said that it was the Soviets that created the concept of jihad in Afghanistan to fight against the West, when it's publicly acknowledged and supported by documents that it was the US that had funneled billions of dollars to the Mujahideen. And
that's never been denied. We don't deny for a minute that we helped the Mujahideen resist the Soviets in Afghanistan. But it was the invasion of Afghanistan that precipitated the consequences which we see in that part of the world to this day, namely the rise of fundamentalism, the pulverization of a society, as a consequence of which pulverization, extremism, became increasingly dominant. Now, the conclusion you draw from that is that the Soviets should have therefore been permitted to prevail and that the West should have simply ignored the resistance, then I part company with you. I think that would have been an error. 2 more questions, okay?
do you think it was morally acceptable to use Afghan lives to further the interests of the United States?
In other words, if we had assisted more effectively, let's say the Jews fighting in the ghettos, we would have been morally guilty. Is that what you're trying to say? That it's better to let people massacre someone even if they're resisting? Is that what you're trying to say?
I'm asking you.
Well, I'm asking you to think.
Why do you think many people, including some of your own colleagues, claim that Dr. Brzezinski is the one who was mainly responsible for the start of the Afghan jihad and as a consequence the rise of the Islamic fundamentalist movement?
You know, there are many people who live in a world of paranoia. There's an organization run by LaRouche in this country which specializes in that. There are a lot of people in the world who interpret everything that happens in the most dramatically conspiratorial terms and find satisfaction in explaining everything in terms of Manichaean categories of good and evil.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I left Dr. Brzezinski with an understanding of the reasons behind the events that led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But one question still floated in my mind. Why did the US choose Pakistan to lead its war against the Soviets?
The reality is that you're going to look at the map of Afghanistan and say, if it's the U.S. policy to provide assistance to the people fighting in there, where are you going to do it? Iran, not likely. China, not likely. Soviets, no. It's Pakistan. You're going to do it through the Pakistanis.
Pakistan played a very key role. Pakistan was a frontline state during the battle against the Soviet occupation. Pakistan and many other countries also felt threatened that perhaps with the communist superpower on their borders, Pakistan could be the next domino to fall. So Pakistan did join the resistance against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
We had this long-standing relationship with the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, which unusually enough is a military intelligence service, and we usually don't have contact with military intelligence. But in this particular case in Pakistan, the CIA had run the U-2 program starting in the 50s, and it was run out of Peshawar base, so we had to have contact with them, and that's how this relationship developed.
There were billions of dollars that were funneled through the ISI. Stansfield Turner, the CIA director during the Carter administration, estimated that at best probably 20% of that money actually got to the soldiers who were fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan.
Oh, this just was taken off, skimmed off the top as the arms went through one place and another. Each stage they went through, inside Pakistan, inside Afghanistan, somebody was taking a cut on the deal. In order to facilitate the flow of this, you in effect had to bribe people along the road. This is not unusual in that part of the world at all.
That's an awful lot of billions of dollars that went into private armies, into building private armies, into building private bunkers, into buying high technology for terrorism.
The CIA used the BCCI as a paymaster. The Mujahideen operations were financed very extensively through the BCCI, through branches.
And what is BCCI?
Bank of Credit and Commerce International, sometimes known as the Banks of Crooks and Criminals International. A perfect vehicle, branches in the Gulf, ability to move money into Pakistan, branches in Pakistan, close to Zia-ul-Haq, close to the Pakistani government, had everything that was needed.
If you want to move arms around, you don't want your bankers to talk about it. Yet, if you're involved in those kinds of activities, you need access to finance. You want to be unregulated, and you've got to make foreign exchange transactions and so on, and you want the people who are doing that for you to be complicit with you and not tell the authorities anything and so on. And if you were looking for that kind of service, BCCI was pretty much top of the list.
They did money laundering, they financed arms trading, financed smuggling operations, assisted various people in looting their countries.
It had a very substantial and far-flung international network, so therefore if you wanted to move money around the world, it was a very attractive bank to go to. It was equally attractive to intelligence agencies.
The CIA used them, the Mossad used them, various Arab intelligence agencies used them, the Russians used them, the British used them. Everybody used them. It was wonderful. Sometimes they traded information from one intelligence agency to the other. If it wasn't as serious and as deadly as it turned out to be, it would be damn comical.
We know to a certainty that the bank had certain links to the CIA, in that the CIA used it as a conduit bank for CIA accounts. The bank was a conduit for funding to the Mujahideen.
Did Abedi and BCCI have political influence in the United States?
Of course. The thesis of the people who ran BCCI was what they called rent-a-face. And you would go to a country and find some prominent people and rent them, and use their prominence to buy entree and position and power in whatever country you were operating in.
Former presidential advisor Clark Clifford was Abedi's man in Washington and his lawyer. Former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Andrew Young worked for Abedi as a consultant. Former British Prime Minister James Callaghan accompanied Abedi on economic missions. And perhaps most impressive of all the men seen with Abedi, a former president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Carter flew around the world with Abedi, with millions of dollars from BCCI to promote good works in the Third World.
Well, Abedi, the head of BCCI, was one of the biggest single donors to the Carter Center, which is what the Carter Presidential Library is called in Atlanta, Georgia.
The Bank of Credit and Commerce is unique among all the banks that I've ever dealt with. They are major sponsors.
Mr. Carter may not have known it, but he became BCCI's most important ambassador. And law enforcement authorities now say BCCI used Carter's trips to Africa to further its larger, grander scheme.
Carter had so much prestige, particularly in certain third world countries, partly because of his human rights policy, that he could go on a trip to someplace like Nigeria with Abedi, and local people would see him and might come to the conclusion that, well, if Carter is associating with him, he must be all right.
¡Viva el señor Jimmy Carter! ¡Viva!
And Jimmy Carter continued to accept large donations from BCCI after the charters.
Yes.
How do you explain that? I don't understand.
Don't ask me, ask him.
So I decided to write to President Carter and to ask him whether he wished to respond to the claims made by Jack Blum and others about his relationship with BCCI. But both my requests were turned down.
I mean, what if Hitler was giving you money? I mean, where do you draw the line? Are you going to say that it doesn't matter how disreputable the source is? You're going to accept it? You know, if some mafia boss is giving you money, you're going to take it because you're using it for a good cause. That's fallacious, and it ignores a couple of other things. That much of this money was stolen from impoverished people in the third world. So you're saying, wait a minute,
If I don't continue to accept money that's been stolen from third world people, I can't give money to poor people in the third world. That's ludicrous. And then it also ignores the fact that by continuing your relationship with him, you are burnishing his image, giving him credibility, which makes it easier for him to continue committing crimes, to continue defrauding people. Because you were giving him this aura of respectability that he needs as a con man to fool people, to fool future victims.
And the American people didn't know about this?
You know, one of the problems with all of this story is it's a complicated story. How do you keep anybody's attention for anything this complicated? Now, the truth of the matter was it was rather straightforward and simple. A bunch of Middle East crooks figured out that there were a bunch of people in the United States who liked money, and they paid them. It's not very complicated.
Despite the Bank of England's closure of BCCI in 1991, its financing of international arms and drugs trading had played a key role in privatizing the jihad and international terrorism.
The BCCI scandal never dealt with the money that was going from those bank accounts to the Mujahideen, or the money that was coming from that part of the world, allegedly from some very serious drug dealing that was going on that had been privatized, which was a rather frightening process. Guns for drugs came in, the avenues were opened up for the drug dealers, the routes to Europe, to South America, and as a result of that, individuals became economies of their own.
Mujahideen needed to have weapons to fight, needed to have money to buy weapons and to buy ammunition. Then the drugs start to be very, very important, and one of the only way to get finance. The farmers are not the one who make big money with drugs. The thing is that it's the only crops that can give them cash money immediately. A farmer from east of Afghanistan cannot cultivate wheat to export it to south of Afghanistan. There is no more road, no more truck, no more commercial exchange.
Les services secrets de l'armée pakistanaise, ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence, ont joué un rôle très important dans la protection du trafic. En effet, les mêmes camions qui s'appelait National Logistic Cell, qui apportait des armes en Afghanistan, revenaient chargés d'opium que les services secrets de l'armée pakistanaise, qui avait le monopole de la livraison des armes aux Moudjahidines, faisaient transformer dans les zones tribales.
The arms were taken to Afghanistan from Karachi all the way up country to the mountains in Khyber, and a lot of these arms were sold on the black market. So we had the Kalashnikov culture, where many people had access to sophisticated weapons, took the law into their hands.
Heroin was coming out of Afghanistan by the metric ton. The amounts of heroin were staggering. The amounts of money involved were staggering. There was a seizure of a ship off the coast of Turkey that had come from the Makran coast of Pakistan that had 12 tons, metric tons of heroin and heroin derivatives on it. That is such a startlingly large number. It's sort of like the world supply for a year.
The increase in drugs that were flowing into the United States was very observable.
We had many calls during the 1980s from people. We had a call from a London bureau chief of one of the three major networks at one point, and said that he told us that some Afghans had just been arrested in London by British police with a large supply of bricks of hashish stamped on it for the freedom fighters.
80% of the heroin consumed in Europe is coming from Afghanistan, and about 40% of heroin coming to the United States is coming from Afghanistan also. So they know it, of course. But one more time, they don't care. They're not there for fighting drugs.
Who's they?
CIA.
The policymakers absolutely closed their eyes to the criminal behavior of our allies and supporters in that war. The policymakers ignored their drug dealing, their stealing, and their human rights violations. The policymakers, and I stress policymakers, allowed them to compensate themselves for helping us in that war by remaining silent in the face of their impropriety and by quietly undercutting law enforcement and human rights agencies but might have caused them difficulty.
Are you suggesting that the intelligence community thwarted or stopped prosecutions which have gone forward?
That too.
Well, could you be?
Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying here that there was such a secret decision.
Did I, know there was a drug problem in Afghanistan? Of course there is. Of course there was. Of course there is. There is today. Did we devote our resources to fighting the narcotics problem? No. And there is a complicated set of very good reasons. One, that I wasn't charged with doing that, and B, it would possibly detract from the accomplishing what was an overwhelmingly large mission, that is driving the Soviet army out of Afghanistan.
Milt Bearden came into the picture as the chief in Islamabad, a very effective and credible CIA officer.
How did you get involved in the Afghan jihad or operation, and in what capacity?
In the spring of 1985, Bill Casey, who was at that time the director of CIA, tapped me to go out and take over the program for CIA in Pakistan, which was where we managed what we called a covert action program to assist the Mujahideen. It was a tradition for the Central Intelligence Agency director, Bill Casey, to see his chiefs as they went out to take over the job in the field. And I'd known Casey since the earliest days that he'd been out at Langley, and actually considered him not only my director, but as sort of a friend within that context. He was very straightforward. He said, Milt, I want you to go out there and win. He was a deeply moral man, which a lot of people don't understand. The type of man, Catholic, who would go to church on a Wednesday or a Thursday or a Saturday to go to Mass. And he believed we'd reached a point to where fighting to the last Afghan to bleed the Soviets in Afghanistan was no longer moral.
Did you have many obstacles in distributing the arms to the Mujahideen?
Not as many as people would say. The reality is if you could get the weapons inside the country, and if they didn't fall into the hands of the enemy, and they were picked up by people willing to use them to resist the Soviets, that's fine. There were 7 different groups of Afghans, generally thought of as 4 of the fundamentalists and 3 of the moderates. They were all, to their one degree or another, Islamists.
These are bandit ringleaders. Dozens of crimes and the deaths of thousands of people are on their conscience. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He stands for the restoration of the feudal regime in Afghanistan. The CIA wants to make him the country's prime minister.
I just would like to talk to you just for a few minutes about Hekmatyar. At some point, you decided to actually have a meeting or a series of meetings with him one-on-one. Why did you decide to do that?
Hekmatyar was the most controversial of the 7. He began his great controversy with the Reagan administration when he accompanied the other resistance leaders to the UN to make their case and refused to travel on down to Washington with the others to be the guest of the president at the White House.
These visitors that we have with us, 6 from the Afghanistan freedom fighters. There's a man here whose wife was killed in front of their 2 children. Another one who lost his brother in the tunnel in a village in which 105 people were massacred by fire and chemicals. One of them lost a brother. One is the mayor of that village where that took place. They're here to try and tell the outside world, the free world, what's really going on in Afghanistan.
So he decided to personally insult the President of the United States. The one meeting we had together, he said, "You've come to kill me." And he's sitting there with his agate prayer beads. And he says, "I can see you're your arm. I said, I was, but it wasn't where he was looking. And he said, maybe not you, but maybe you. You're going to kill me. And I said, engineer, I'm not going to kill you. He was engineer Gulbuddin. He wasn't an engineer, but in the Afghan war, if you weren't a mullah or a Molvi, which is another holy man, you had to be an engineer, because then there's nothing to call you. I often wonder how it would have been different if I'd have actually gone ahead and shot him, but I did not. And this is actually a camp inside Afghanistan where Hekmatyar kept some of his weapons. From left to right, you have Hekmatyar, Rabbani, William Webster, Director General ISI Hamid Gul, Robert Oakley, the ambassador, Richard Kerr, the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, me, and a brigadier. 1986 or 7, with Milt Bearden and his gang.
Do you know where Hekmatyar is today?
He's a wanted man, a hunted man, and tops on the list of the U.S. Army in the second round of American involvement in Afghanistan.
How did you feel back then about your alliance with controversial figures such as Hekmatyar?
The reality was that we were going to do our thing there until we got our satisfaction out of it. We, the West, we, the coalition, we, the United States, and got the Soviets out of there. And then we were going to leave the area.
How anyone could be stupid enough not to think about the long-term consequences is beyond me. Now, part of the problem is that Casey was living in the past. He wasn't thinking of the future. He didn't care about the future. Consequences were not his answer. All he wanted to do was rip the Russians.
Besides maiming a person, war greatly affects one's spirit. That is, most men who have been through a war have been crippled morally.
Большинство из людей, прошедших войну, это просто калеки моральные. Любое воюющее поколение, оно исправляет ошибку предыдущего.
Any generation that's fighting corrects the errors committed by the previous generation. But I don't think anyone from my generation took part in deciding whether to wage war in Afghanistan or not. My wish is that as few people as possible in Afghanistan and in the world in general would have anything to do with weapons.
And then the war ends, the Russians go, and we say, hey, we're out of here. And we leave this lunatic asylum to go marching on, now to go after the Indians in Kashmir and to do whatever other mischief they feel like doing. And they wind up hating everybody in the West, not just Russians, but they'll hate Americans, they'll hate French people, they hate everybody.
Once again, I felt overwhelmed. I took a moment to look back and see how I got here. How, starting from the Cold War and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, did I end up with covert operations, complicit governments, corrupt banks, arms trading, and international drug trafficking? What was wrong with this picture? Was there an invisible line that connected them all? It seemed as if each one needed the services of the other to achieve its own objectives, regardless of the consequences.
Time went on until we came to the September 11th stage. We had a super magnification of the picture. We're having a full-scale polarization of the world between Muslims with their culture, other interests, with a spearhead as bin Laden, as a sort of virtual leader, and the West or the non-Muslims led by America. Now, how was this polarization created? It was not created by destroying the two towers.
The story starts with a messianic belief that they had taken on one superpower and they could take on another superpower. They told me that we defeated the Soviets and we can defeat the Americans. And I said, but it was a proxy war. You were given the money, you were given the satellite pictures, you were given everything by the Americans and money by Saudi Arabia and others. And they said, no, we defeated the Soviet Union, we can defeat the Americans.
Why do you think the mobilization of Muslim fighters in the Afghan jihad against the Soviets was successful and has not been so in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, if you measure success in terms of expelling the Soviets from Afghanistan, I think we have very complex reasons. But if you talk about a victory of those who believe in jihad in terms of moral victory, that they have mobilized people with this new language. The only solution is jihad and using force. And this momentum has never gone down. It's always in the upper direction, whether it is in Palestine or Afghanistan or Chechnya or Bosnia or anywhere in the world.
Continually, and to this day, Osama will talk about the fact that it was the Muslim forces which destroyed the Soviet Union. And that difference of opinion, if you like, is an extremely important one in the long term.
Bin Laden packed his bags and left Afghanistan and Pakistan in 1988. It was my intelligence, not my intelligence, but Pakistan's intelligence, that brought Bin Laden back.
We were involved in sending Bin Laden to Afghanistan when we told the Sudanese, kick him out. They said, Somalia? We said, no. They said, Afghanistan? We said, okay.
He undoubtedly was created, in a sense, by other forces. What happened, and classically always happens, almost always happens in these circumstances, that he grew bigger than all of that, and they couldn't control him.
The world order, which is based on that the West is dominating, exporting, controlling the world's economy, and on top of the West comes America. This structure, where we come on the bottom of that structure, we in the Arab and Muslim worlds, we are just having natural resources, and seen by the West as hopeless idiots who do not know how to use those resources, and they have to suck those resources. This world structure, world order, Bin Laden is not happy with. We either become the center of the world, we are the dominators, or at least we become equal to the others.
I was wondering how the relationship between politics and economy had changed as a result of the end of the Cold War.
Once the Berlin Wall comes down, there is no more duopoly of power. Then, of course, politics becomes liberalized in the way that the economy becomes liberalized. But in political activity, it becomes then possible for people and interest groups and lobby groups to define their interests in a way which was not really possible before. But of course, at another level, it means that it's possible now for more radical groups, shall we say, in society to be able to define their interests and their goals and their aspirations in ways that wasn't possible before.
When I started looking into whether the economic interests of private sectors had direct influence in shaping public policies, the road led me back to a story involving two international oil companies, Brides and Unicor.
As a consequence of globalization in the 1990s, and also as a consequence of the destruction of the Soviet Union, American corporations and American politicians become even closer than they were before. And the Unicor story is an outstanding example of the negative consequences of when this happened. Brides, which was a small oil company from Argentina wanted to build a pipeline from Central Asia, where they discovered that there was one of the largest reservoirs of natural gas in the world, across Afghanistan to Pakistan, where the gas would then be taken across the world. Pakistan, of course, was supporting the pipeline.
I'm a great believer in trade and investment. And first of all, you trade with your neighbors because they're nearby and it's geographically easier to do so. So I had begun talks with India, and I had tried to moderate the politics of Afghanistan to get access to the Central Asian republics. Now, after we successfully, we told them, I said, look, go and win the hearts and minds of the Afghans. They've only known war. They don't know anything but war. So let's start building roads. And I said, let's build telecommunications, let's build electric wires, because if we bring electricity and telephone and roads and communication to the Afghans, they'll get involved in trade. Now, when we did this and we succeeded, suddenly Briders appeared on our door. And suddenly Briders said, we want to get this thing with Turkmenistan. We said, fine, but everybody in my cabinet laughed. When I called them over, they said, ha, 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 look at them thinking they're going to build this. But anyway, we'll keep them on board. Because fighting was still going on in parts of Afghanistan. And then, suddenly one day Unical arrived. And then we were under enormous pressure by the embassy in Islamabad, the American embassy in Islamabad, to break off the Briders contract. And we didn't know what was happening. So I think what we started off in innocence for the benefit of the people of Afghanistan in communications, and what we started in innocence to try and have our trade, we got caught in a much bigger game, a much bigger strategic game.
Maybe in these particular circumstances, Benazir Bhutto decided that she was going to stand by Briders. But personally, looking at the policy and the politics of Benazir Bhutto, she was very much also part of these elites. She would never have gone against the United States, because the United States was what kept her in power.
Do you actually believe that Unical's lobbying in Washington had direct influence in overthrowing your government?
Well, I don't know how much influence Unical directly had, although some people have said to me that it was their lobbying that led also partially to the overthrow of my government. Obviously, they lobby and they can have access to government, but how critical their lobbying is to actually decision-making, I don't know. I'm not an American, I don't have access to government, but this much I know, that they have a strong voice.
Osama has consistently railed against the Western powers for effectively stealing the oil from Saudi Arabia. That's the way in which they would portray it. They believe that the West is getting its oil too cheap from Saudi Arabia in particular, and that the Saudi ruling family is complicit in that whole process.
Take, for example, one barrel of oil, we sell it for $20. They sell it in the market here for $130. So although we produce the oil, they take 80% of the income of that barrel, although it is our oil.
What if bin Laden's vision for a new world order, the way you described it, becomes reality? I don't see how he will be able to sustain an Islamic economy without having ties with the rest of the world, especially the West.
In Islam, if you run a Muslim economy, which is just devoid of interests, that is the difference between Muslim economy and non-Muslim economy. There's not much difference. Just remove interest, which is the base of the deal between merchants in the Western world. But even if you are hostile to another country, even if you are in a war with another country, you are allowed in Islam to exchange material and to sell and buy, and especially if that trade is vital to your life.
They have to sell the oil because they've got nothing else to sell, really. So it's the only resource they've got.
Bin Laden, in one of the interviews, he said, neither we nor anybody else would drink the oil. It has to be exported, it has to be sold. But it would be sold with our conditions, with with our terms. We would decide how much we produce. We would decide for what price we sell.
If you had, a hostile to the West, or hostile to oil-consuming nations, I should say, government in, a major Middle Eastern or other oil-producing country, and if OPEC, were to become increasingly under the influence of that country, where the quantity and the price, or both, of crude oil were to be determined, for political reasons rather than the way that it is at the moment, which is kind of quasi-political but also largely economic. Now you're talking the possibility of doing damage to the world economy, which I don't think any bomb could really do.
I think we're not talking about a clash of civilization or a clash of fundamentalism. Religion is only the ideology. I mean, the real clash is between two economic systems. One system is the West, which is the dominant system. The other system is the East, which is the revolutionary one.
It's a sort of quasi-Marxist approach to the world, which sees struggle in as a rising from the clash of sort of economic systems and economic classes. And there's no question that huge tracts of human and social history have been formed by the clashes between economic classes. I mean, the English Civil War, the American Civil War, the French Revolution, you name it. However, if global terrorism were to have in my view, a meaningful impact on the world economy and on the world's financial structure and so on and so forth, the way that that would happen is less via an individual, outrage or an individual incident, but rather through, an organized attempt to take over a state.
If bin Laden has come to play a key role in the economic equation, then I ask myself, what role has he begun to play in the media?
The American establishment has been working almost like a very successful, very effective PR company for bin Laden.
When I turn on a television set and there's this drumbeat about the war, the war, the war, and they have logos and music and all the other good stuff, all of that's to drive up viewership.
Keep people in a constant state of panic and you can carry out an attack on them. And that's precisely what they're doing now. Back to Osama bin Laden. If you're in a state of panic, you have to be terrified of somebody.
What does that say about the American people?
It's not the American people. They're not making these decisions.
But they elect these
they
people
didn't.
into the
No,
office.
look, they didn't elect anybody. We don't live in a democracy, and there's no pretense that we do. We live in what's called by political scientists a polyarchy. That means a system of elite decision and public ratification. It goes all the way back to James Madison and the Constitutional Convention, that there's supposed to be a small category, which Madison called the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, and they're supposed to make the decisions. And the public are what are called spectators, not participants. They're supposed to appear every once in a while and pick among the privileged and the powerful and those who serve them, and then go back to their own pursuits. And there's a huge effort made to control those pursuits. I mean, just take the media. They're just huge corporations selling audiences to other businesses. They have their interests and concerns. When people talk about the national interest, that's just propaganda. It means the interests of the rich and the powerful. And yes, the media do serve that national interest.
I think that the job of the media is, after all, to sell newspapers, as someone once said at the time of the Spanish-American War. And the behavior of the New York press at the time of the Spanish-American War is a perfect model. They announced the breakout of war the day before it was declared. What's changed? It sells newspapers.
The American and international media went nuts over the year 2000. Two things were going to happen. Your computer was going to crash at 1 second after midnight, And bin Laden was going to blow up your New Year's Eve party, whether it was in Toronto or Sydney Harbor or Times Square or Jerusalem. And so bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, and the myth was created, and it's never been able to, you've never been able to turn it back.
When you go to the south of Algeria, near the Sahara Desert, you see children playing football wearing a bin Laden t-shirt. This is how popular bin Laden is.
We have created a North Star for terrorism, and all the people who are out there who may hate us Americans have some sort of a guy, but it's almost like, does Elvis Presley really control all the Elvis Presley fan clubs that are still out there? I don't think so.
After all the searching and questioning, what comes back to me time and time again is that everyone seems to be joining the dots in their own version of events.
The Middle East, you've got 250 million people who have no hope. They have corrupt, sinkhole, stinking governments that are straight out of the 14th century. Illiteracy, slavery, child abuse, sexual abuse are the commonplace. Now, in that environment, what do? What has to be done is people have to be educated. They need opportunity. They need health care. They need a government that does something other than steal from a mass of people. Instead, our approach is figure out which of the crooks running this mess will be most friendly to us, and then pay them and help them stay in power.
And in fact, the whole system is just taken over from the British. During the First World War, they described the system they were constructing as in the following terms. What we have to do is construct an Arab facade of weak, dependent governments that'll control their own populations, and behind the facade we will rule. We'll rule behind constitutional fictions of various kinds. If they get into trouble controlling their own populations, we'll bring in the muscle, which in those days was primarily air power, to attack the uncivilized tribes, Kurds and Afghans. And the reasons were perfectly clearly stated. The distinguished statesman Lord George said, we have to reserve the right to bomb niggers. That's the fundamental moral principle of Western thought. Have to reserve the right to bomb niggers, and it plays out in various different ways. The niggers that he was talking about were Iraqis, Kurds, Afghans, and so on. That's nothing dramatic has changed in that regard. We're still going to bomb the niggers. And that's a crucial way of maintaining certain systems of power.
Copy 6 miles. Let me know when you see the target area and I'll start the ball gun.
Good, come back on those guys. Here we go.
Get ready! Get ready! He went down to the ground.
Guy moving to the south there, yep. Got 2 of them there.
Get ready! Back on the other guys.
Oh, you got the other guy.
Bin Laden is probably aiming for much bigger than simple revenge from America. What Bin Laden wants is a full chaos in the region. And the chaos in the region will make those local regimes collapse very easily. And then the culture of jihad will supersede. It's not only the matter of military coup or 1 or 2 operations. No, it's going to be a new culture of jihad. The default thinking in the mind of the people is going to be jihad. This is what Bin Laden's ambition is. He wants to force people to feel depressed, that they can never achieve victory with the war against terrorism. Whenever they feel they have finished their job, they are having another attack.
So we created a kind of religious fanatic force, and the purpose was to kill Russians. How anyone could be stupid enough not to think about the long-term consequences is beyond me. Over the years, we had encouraged radical Muslims to fight communists. We did it in Indonesia twice. Millions died. It was ugly. It happened in other places. And I think it's a mistake people make to think in terms of different administrations as being a sharp break from prior administrations. If you read American history carefully, you begin to see continuity, and you begin to understand that there's very little that comes afresh, that really there's a kind of permanent approach to things, and maybe there's a different face on it from time to time, but the approach is absolutely the same approach. So if you go back to Harry Truman and Harry Truman dealing with the North Koreans, when the North Koreans invaded, the model that Truman set in place for dealing with the North Koreans was precisely the same way we handled Vietnam. Yet no one really understood the difference between the two.
We better at some point not feel it's unpatriotic or weak to say, why did these guys do it? That debate or dialogue is not yet begun in this country. We're just having a war against terrorism, whether it takes us to Afghanistan or it takes us to Iraq, rather than saying, time out. What do you think? Why did those guys do it? What you'll end up with, if we proceed on a straight line from where we are today, is you'll end up fighting the birth rate of the Islamic world, which is 3% plus, which doubles every 25 years. And guess what? Ain't no white folks can win that battle.
Once you start defining everyone as an enemy, you don't stop until you look in the mirror and define yourself as that enemy. And then there's only one choice that you have when you've done that, and that's self-annihilation.
As I look back on the last 3 years, I realize that many different forces have been complicit in creating a myth around bin Laden, a myth which has taken on a life of its own as a mirror for our fears and demons. This myth serves many purposes and interests, whether to sell his t-shirts in the remote streets of the Sahara, to sell books, newspapers, films, foreign policies, economic agendas, and wars. And finally, most disturbing of all, this myth even helps bin Laden himself to sell his own crusade. But what about those whose lives were brutally terminated, and those who are losing their lives every day? How long can we go on believing in this myth? Would the first step to counter and dismantle it perhaps begin by letting go of our own private bin Laden?